Hi, my name's Amos Patrick, and I've been living in Estes Park for about the last 5 years. When I moved here, one of the most exciting things about coming to Estes Park from Iowa was the idea that I might run into famous climbers. And little did I know that I actually moved in across the street from one of Estes' most notable climbers, Douglas Snively. And I've had the great opportunity to go out and have adventures with Douglas and be his climbing partner. And so today I'm going to interview Douglas for the Estes Park Museum and the Estes Park Library. Well, let's start out with some basic information. Can you just state your name?
My name is Melvin Douglas Snively.
And your birth date?
I was born September 26, 1953 in Colorado Springs, Colorado.
All right.
Memorial Hospital.
And when did you start climbing?
I started climbing around I was 16 years old.
And yeah, tell us about that. What was that like?
I started climbing, and it was kind of weird how it started. I always loved climbing trees. I loved climbing the garage, up the fence, walk along the fence to the top of the garage, go up to the peak, jump off the roof. And so me and another neighbor kid, when I was quite a bit younger, before I ever started climbing, we had tree houses down along this river, and we just had tree houses. I loved the movie Tarzan, where we'd swing off vines and stuff. So we had little lines we'd swing over from one limb to the next and stuff. And it was a lot of fun. And I think that was what really, when I started climbing, I look back at that, and that was like just kind of some grassroots, so to speak. So it was a lot of fun. And so I started climbing, and I kind of got started in this. I'd ride my bike a lot, and I'd ride my bike out to the Garden of the Gods, which is, 4 miles from my parents' house. And one day I'm watching these guys, and they had this Tyrolean set up from South Gateway Rock to the top of White Spire there. And they're hooting and hollering, having a great time, and then they would rappel down. I was going like, wow, that's really pretty cool. So I went to the library, checked out this book. And it was the only book that it just had a small section of climbing on it, and it had this guy in with the knickers and the knicker socks and wooden rung ladders, and he had a ball peen hammer for a hammer. And, oh, my dad has a ball peen hammer. So I made up some stuff, and then a friend of mine, Barton Chambon from school, and I would climb, and he lived on the hogback out in the Garden of the Gods. And so he had a little cliff in the backyard, and so we'd, top rope stuff. And then as things progressed, I would met other people out in the Garden of the Gods. And in Colorado Springs, there's the CC College, Colorado College, which is quite good. And they had a little mountaineering club there. And they'd give these little shows. So once I went, and Art Howes, Don Dissett, and Mike Dudley had just finished doing the nose of El Cap, and they probably did a very early ascent, and so maybe the 6th or 7th ascent of the nose. So they set up this big sheet of plywood, and they had bolt hangers on it, and they showed how to do a hanging belay, the Yosemite haul system, where you would haul up all your supplies. And I just thought, wow. After I saw that, things just really took off for me. I couldn't really get enough climbing. And so I started going to the Garden of the Gods more and more and more. I worked at an Army surplus store at the time, and they had some soft iron. And so climbing with Barton, we'd combined our gear together. We actually ended up buying a rope together and stuff. We'd climb in his backyard, go out to the Garden of the Gods, and play around in as things progress. Mostly in the garden, it's like sport climbing. You go from bolt to bolt, and it wasn't like you're placing your own gear and stuff. And then I'm going like, wow, I'd like to pursue this more. So I learned how to aid climb. So we bought pitons, and basically you could go out to North Cheyenne Canyon, because the Army would do this display out there, and they'd pull up in these buses, and all these soldiers would get out, and they'd hand them all like a piece of rope, like 12 or 15 feet long, 3 pitons, and that was their gear for the day. They'd have their water, and then they would pass around a hammer. So these guys go around and just beat the pins in to the surrounding cliffs there in North Cheyenne Canyon. They'd go up and rappel. I'd watch them rappel. Then they had this Tyrolean also set up there it was called the Crow's Nest. It was this little spire, and they had a cable that went from there down to these bleachers there in North Cheyenne Canyon, which I really don't know if they're even there or not anymore. So watching that was like, wow, this is pretty cool. And the cord of rope they gave them was like what we would call a cordelette now, but that was their harness, right? So they'd undo the rope, they'd form a leg loop, tie it around their waist, tie it in a square knot. So that's what I did. And so I learned, how to rappel out there. You could score pitons, and that was the main thing, because they would just go smash them in. They'd all get like 3 of them, and there'd be, maybe 100 soldiers there, all up and down North Cheyenne Canyon, and they'd just go smash them into, some in trees, some in cracks, some are just kind of barely hanging. So you could actually get a lot of used gear. And so one thing led to the next, and we did all the aid climbs in basically the Garden of the Gods with Barton, and I climbed a lot with this guy named Rick Morgan, who turned out to be married to my older sister. So he was my brother-in-law, and we climbed a lot together because, one, he had a car, and I'd see that turquoise Mustang at the top of the hill when I get out of school, and I go, oh, cool, I get to go play for a while. So that was a lot of fun. And so I did a lot with my brother-in-law at the time. They're divorced now, but we did a lot of adventures together, and not only in the Garden of the Gods, but we started going to Turkey Rock, the South Platte area. Just basically, there's a lot of climbing around Colorado Springs, but mostly because of limited time, we would mostly go to the Garden of the Gods or end up in North Cheyenne Canyon. So that was kind of my grassroots of starting out climbing there.
Was there a guidebook at that time for the Garden of the Gods?
No.
How did you find your routes?
I would go to, there was a shop downtown, and it was called the Mountain Chalet. And it had just kind of opened, and there's a guy there, his name was Muff, his real name was Steve Cheney, but everybody called him Muff. And he was a climber, and he once took Barton and I out, and we top roped the White Spire, and he showed us some things, how to belay, and everything was a body belay, no belay device or anything. The rope just went around your waist, and you just held on tight. So that was our source of information as far as the climbs went around the Colorado Springs area. And then as Turkey Rock became developed, you pretty much knew everybody that was going up there. I met Jimmy Dunn out in North Cheyenne Canyon. He actually showed me how to tie in using a water knot instead of a square knot. And so then I started climbing with Jimmy a lot, and that was kind of a real heads up for me because he was pretty talented already at the time.
So who would you say your mentors were?
I would say it was everybody I would climb with, and I would say Jimmy Dunn was a good mentor. Dan McClure definitely was a very talented individual, and his ethics were impeccable. It was like going with Daniel was always a privilege. So.
What do you mean by his ethics were impeccable?
No hanging, no, you did it your first try or else you didn't do it. You don't hang on gear, you don't rehearse the moves. It's like you just do it. And he would do it. He was really a talented individual.
And who were some of the big names at the time? They're like people you look like the rock stars.
Of course, Royal Robbins, Vaughn Chenard, Tom Frost, anybody that was doing pioneering in Yosemite at the time. So those were like, wow, they're doing these really impressive climbs right on a big piece of rock. So, and it was really hard to say, but basically people I really looked up to was probably my comrades that I really went out with from day to day, and that was a lot of fun. So.
And then can you think of any experiences that shaped your climbing later in life?
Oh, that's a good question. As far as, I think there's a lot of experience that lead in, one experience leads to another experience, and such is life, that's the way things are. So, and it would always, some were not such good experiences, and then some were like, wow, this is a really great experience here, and let's do it again. And so it might be at a different cliff or a different location altogether, so.
All right, so this was like in high school level or
Yeah,
high school
yeah,
times?
I was in high school. I started climbing basically at 16. I was a sophomore, and so I climbed a lot with Barton, my brother-in-law, and then I met Bill Westbay and Dan McClure and Jimmy Dunn, and then things really changed meeting those guys is once they had already all gone to Yosemite, and then one summer, Barton's parents said they were going up to the Pacific Northwest, but they were going down through California to Yosemite, and I just started climbing. And of course, you always hear things about Yosemite. And so basically I went on his family vacation with him, and we went to Yosemite, and we're only there like 2 days or something like that. But it was a lot of fun. It was a real eye-opener. No one was up on El Cap, but I could envision, wow, this is like a huge rock. And I wasn't really sure because I was pretty naive in a lot of ways. As we went over to Middle Cathedral Rock with our little bit of gear that we had, thinking we would climb Middle Cathedral that day. And after getting up like a pitch and a half, we realized that we're going like nowhere quick. And you look over at El Cap, and we're still way down here, and it's still way up there. So that was a pretty cool experience in that I realized, like, wow, this is really what I kind of want to do. So it made high school tough the last year.
All right. So how did you end up in Estes Park? Like, what was your first experience up here?
My first experience in Estes was when I was a senior in high school. Stuart Green and I came up to climb the Diamond on Long's Peak, and that was my first experience, which is kind of huge when I think about it. And that a lot of it is I was pretty naive, and we had the Paul Nesbitt book, and it had some pictures of someone on table ledge, just kind of standing there, and then some people aid climbing, and that was it. They said something about D7, and we go, well, we could probably go do that, right? Because I'd been practicing nailing a lot in the Garden of the Gods and Turkey Rock and South Platte area. So Stuart and I came up on our spring break from school, and I drove my 55 Chevy up here and drove right into the Longs Peak parking lot, started hiking up, and, basically with what gear we had, and went up to the Diamond. I can't remember. I think we hiked in, spent the night by Chasm Lake, then got up to Broadway the next day and started just climbing. And luckily, Don Dissett and Mike Dudley were up there doing the Yellow Wall. And there were a lot of encouragement because Stuart kind of bombed out, so to speak. He just wasn't into it. So I led all the pitches, and I'd made this hammock that I had bivouacked in that night. And in the books you'd read about Yosemite, or in the Nesbitt book, you'd see someone in a down jacket, and that's what you wore for your bivy sack. And I had the haul bag, and I remember being so cold that my teeth were chattering so bad that they hurt for like 3 days. My jaws hurt on the sides, and Stuart, I think, was a little more prepared because he had climbed Keeners before, so he was kind of like, oh, I know how to get up there type of deal, and I know how to get down, which, well, great, okay, let's go. So we ended up doing the Diamond. We bivouacked on the face, finished the next day, hiked out in the dark, and we're both very exhausted, I remember. It was like much more work than we realized.
You said this was over spring break?
Yeah.
So that'd be like March?
Yes, end of March, very cold, and a lot of snow on the hike in, but I just figured, well, that's the way it always was, right? Didn't realize that if you came in July or August, it's gonna be much nicer and a little more pleasant for bivouacs and stuff. But anyways, we made it, and I was glad that Don and Mike were up there, and they, come on, you guys can do this. So, and they're good motivators. They're always like right over here, and they go, okay, another pitch, and they bivouacked right there, and then they're gone the next day, like instantly. It seemed like.
So that was your first experience in Estes Park.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good one.
Yeah.
How did you end up moving up here then?
After that, I traveled around, did some climbing with Jimmy Dunn in the desert, and then we drove back through here because I never really came into town on that first trip here. So I didn't really realize that Lumpy Ridge was there, Lily Mountain and stuff. And as we came through, we visited a friend of Jimmy's in Allen's Park, Michael Covington at the time, and we stopped at Lily Lake, and we did a climb up on one of the buttresses there. And we drove on into town, and Jimmy's going, there, it's Lumpy Ridge, and blah, blah, blah. And that was kind of my first view of it. So basically, I fell in love with the place. I really did. And plus, it was such a concentrated place of lots of climbing. And so I ended up moving here pretty much full time, kind of off and on for a few years in '72. And we would crash at Komito's shop at the time he was out at Beaver Point, which was at Marys Lake Road and the highway there. And we'd just sleep between the rows of boots. I loved it because the smell of the leather was so nice. And, you know, I'd just roll my bedroll out between the Varicors and the PAs over here and the RDs. When we had them all hanging up on racks, and you know, someone else would be sleeping in the next aisle over there. And in the morning, you just roll up your bedroll and put it away and go goof off for the rest of the day. So Komito was very tolerable of all of us kind of outlaws just hanging out in his shop, you know. So
who else was hanging out in Komito's shop at this time?
Well, there was Michael Covington was there, and he had the guide service in, or the concession to the park. And it's just like basically Michael, Billy, and I, and then Dan McClure on occasions, because when I first came here, I moved to Fort Collins first, and I stayed with Dan and his brother, Bruce, and they had this kind of funky place. They called it Moore Manor, and you know, Dan's brother was very much, I wouldn't say, yeah, a hippie. You know, he had goats and chickens in the house, and you just got kind of, you know, shoo the chicken off the couch, and there's the goat. It's kind of like push it outside, and I found it kind of like a little bit much for me, so I'd sleep outside under this camper shell because it didn't have funny odors and stuff, and I felt like I had my own little domain there. So I stayed there, and then we'd come up here on the weekends, and I ended up started working for Michael Covington, and ended up just staying here. So
you got introduced into all this through Jimmy Dunn mostly?
Pretty much, yeah.
And then you started working for Covington as a guide?
Yeah. It took a while because it was so slow. Really, there was only enough work for one or two people, and then as things grew, it became where, you know, there'd be like 3 of us working full-time and 4 of us, and each season it got busier and busier. And then in 1973, Steve moved a shop from the Beaver Point place down to where Colorado Mountain School is now. So we all hung out upstairs. Michael had rented the upstairs, Steve had the downstairs, so all us guides would live upstairs, and we'd work and go play on Lumpy Ridge and do routes in the park all the time. So
why was it called Fantasy Ridge?
It was just a name that Michael came up with. You know, I'm not sure where the fantasy part came from, to be honest with you. I really don't know. But I'm sure he could tell you some harebrained story about it all.
So what did you do as a guide?
Mostly as a guide, we taught a lot of beginning courses. So what we had different things called basic rockcraft would be where you'd just go out and learn simple things like, you know, put your harness on, tie into the rope, tie into the belay anchor itself, and also how to rappel. And then at the end of the day, we would show people how to belay, you know, going from tree to tree. You'd run backwards and take a little fall, so they'd have an idea of what it was like to catch a fall and stuff. And at the end of the day, we'd hike back over this way on Lumpy Ridge towards Twin Owls, and we had this little small spire there, and we called it Basic Rock. So at the end of the day, that was kind of the highlight, is you'd climb the small spire, rappel off the top. That was the end of the day. If you wanted to pursue things, then we had Rock 1, Rock 2 courses where in Rock 1 we'd go in and you'd learn how to place gear and basically, you know, hex-centrics and stoppers, and there were some cams at the time, not too many, but we'd pretty much just stick with basics. And then, you know, as things progress, you'd show people how to place, you know, belay anchors, you know, how to belay up, down, and maybe lower someone if they're having a problem. So it would really depend on what they'd want to do. So, and some people would really pursue things. Most of the time you just do a basic class and that was it. And then we had a thing set up where you do basic Rock 1 and Rock 2 and then climb Hallett's Peak or the Petit Grappon as kind of a grand finale thing. And you'd give them a little certificate, you know, that they had passed this course and then did the climb at the end, and that was their choice to do the Grappon or Hallett's Peak. So most people would choose the Grappon. So I've climbed the Grappon 20-some times.
What kind of clients were they? Were they from Colorado?
They're from everywhere. A lot of people would find out about climbing and just want a basically general knowledge, I felt, and just for their own peace of mind, so if someone asked them a question about climbing, could give a good answer. So a lot of people came from the Midwest, and mostly that's where a lot of them would come from. And then, yeah, there were people from Colorado, from the South. You know, we have a pretty big tourist industry here from Texas, so a lot of people would be from Texas. And some people from the East Coast, but seldom. That's kind of a long ways. And I also found that it seemed like a lot of people from the East would either go to the Tetons before they would come down here. So they maybe have taken a course through X Mountain Guides and come down and climb with us for a few days. And so a lot of times you'd have a lot of people who would be return clients. Like I guided this guy, Ed Yulee, for years, and he was just a blast because he's an older guy. I took him up the Diamond when he was like 56 years old. And that's pretty impressive for a guy that would climb once a year. And you know, he would get in shape. He played tennis a lot, and he was kind of a mad scientist type guy, little small guy in stature. And I have some pictures of him on the Diamond. He'd always wear like a dress shirt, kind of a nice dress shirt, and these like polyester pants and stuff. And he'd had his little hat on and be like all ready to go. But he was very talented, and I did some wonderful things with him on Long's Peak. We did the Grappone, we did Hallett's, a bunch of different routes on Hallett's Peak, Zumi's Thumb, a lot of stuff on the lower east face of Long's Peak. He really did like Long's Peak, so I climbed. You know, the return clients were really what you wanted because then you were really getting to go climbing and you weren't just an instructor then. So
a story I've come across about you during your guiding days is on the climb of the Ancient Mariner. The rumor has it is, so that's a bolted line now.
Yes.
But the rumor has it that you went up on that face without bolts and while you were guiding a client.
No, I was actually with this young lady by the name of Ann Tarver. And on the first pitch, as you know, you pull over the first pitch and, well, there's a bolt there, but there wasn't. I had to stop her in there. And then I started up the face and it was kind of real spooky. So I traversed right and got back over to, what's the climb called there in the corner?
Sorcerer?
The Sorcerer. And so basically I went over the roof, instantly traversed over the Sorcerer, which was quite hard really and pretty spooky because there was no gear. And so I didn't really do that whole next pitch unprotected or anything. It was like I basically pulled over the roof, traversed over to the Sorcerer. And then Richard Rossiter and partner finished that off, so which is a beautiful climb, it really is.
So you moved to Estes, you started working as a guide. Did that give you a lot of free time?
Not really in the summer. I mean, you know, that first year I stayed here, I had free time, and because I needed money, I would go to Fort Collins and work at Kiefer Concrete because they'd always hire me back. And then in the summer, I would come back up here and then guide. So it would depend. At first, there was free time, and then it kind of seemed like you're busy and you spent your whole summer guiding, like to the point it's like, wow, I'm going out every day. And, you know, for a couple of years, it was a lot of fun, and it became a job, and it's kind of like, wow, I'm spending all my time just working now, not really climbing for the love of climbing. So, and it wasn't bad. It was all in all a good experience. I met some wonderful people through guiding. And then some people are coming, it seems like they just kind of unload their kids for the day and get rid of them, and, you know, basically you're a babysitter sometimes. So, but all in all, it was a lot of fun. You know, I have no regrets at all. You know, I met a lot of wonderful people, and, you know, it kind of Estes Park really became roots then for me.
What did you do in your winters?
In winter, if we had the money, we'd hang out. If you didn't have any money, you'd have to go find a job someplace. And for a few winters, I would go down and work in Fort Collins at this concrete plant. And they'd always go, well, why do you want to go back up there in the summer? Because basically I always felt like if I worked someplace, I'd try to do as good a job as possible. And they never really wanted me to quit because after a few days there, they gave me a truck, laborers, and all these people, and they really wanted me to stay. And they treated me extremely well, but I just wanted to live in Estes Park. So, and they'd actually say, hey, it's okay. I didn't have a vehicle at the time. They'd let me drive the company truck up here on the weekends, I'd crash out at Komito's and we'd either hike around in the wintertime, try going ice climbing someplace or skiing, and just basically ended up staying here. So
one of the more iconic photos for Estes Park climbing is that photo that's in Gillette's book of you and the rest of the Fantasy Ridge guides out in front of Lumpy there. Can you tell me about that photo? Remember that day?
Yeah, it was Michael at the time was going with this lady named Janie Roper, and she was a very good photographer. She used to work at the Ansel Adams studio there in Yosemite, so she was quite savvy on art. She was an artist for one thing. She's a very good photographer, so she ended up taking the picture, and that was myself and Bill Westbay and Dan McClure, and Michael and Jim Bridwell. So, and we all were working pretty much full time then.
And was that sign from the Covington is leaning on a sign? Was that?
Yeah,
like
that's a sign that I had carved, I believe, out and just out of a chisel and stuff, and so it was the sign we'd hung up at the shop. So yeah, it was pretty nice. So it's a cool photo, really. It's pretty classic, really.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Billy Westbay and Bridwell after they did the nose when they're standing out in the meadows there. So anytime you look into the history of climbing in Estes Park, undoubtedly you come across Komito, and you've mentioned staying on his floor and stuff. Can you explain why Komito was so important to the climbing community around here?
Well, it was kind of like he was grounded here already, and he had his shop here, and he had moved here with his family, and they had a place up on Davis Hill where he still lives today. And I think it was a place for us to come. I first met Komito in his shop in Boulder. I was with Jimmy, and I think we were climbing in El Dorado or someplace for the day, and we went over to Steve's shop, and that's where I first met him. And then Duncan Ferguson was working for Steve at the time, and that was pretty much it. So when they moved the shop to Estes Park, it was like he was, one, a source of information, even though he didn't get to get out as much as he probably would have liked to. It's kind of like he was always saying, well, you guys can stay here and stuff, which was huge, really. I mean, I don't know if I would have been that willing to open my doors up and have a store and have all these kind of like long-haired people just kind of come in and take over the place. But he was fine with it as long as, we had cleaned up our mess and stuff, and he used to tease us how it always smelled like bacon when he had come to work, because Michael would cook bacon every morning in the back. There was, in the back of the shop where we kind of lived, there were some sinks, and we had a couple of Coleman stoves, and it was kind of like camping out, but you did have a roof over your head. And Steve was very tolerable for letting people come and just crash out, and his house was always open to anyone, and I have to admire him for that. I really do. So, and that was a good place to hang out. I mean, we lived in his shop for like years, like in the main shop in town. I lived down in the vault for a long time, and it's just because no one was in there, I could sleep in there, and it was like really dark and quiet. And you just kind of push the big door shut, and you could leave all your stuff in there, and it was fine. So, and there'd be sometimes people, maybe 12, maybe 15 people just all over the floor of his store. And it's kind of like, okay, he's going to get here soon. You got to get up and get moving and get out of the way. So, and he is very tolerable of all of us. It's like kind of amazing, really. Things did get broken, and hopefully he never really got ripped off, but I think he did from people, which was sad. And I'm not going to point fingers at people. I could, but I won't. And but yeah, it was just kind of a central hub, and it was a source of information. People would come to us, like the Gillette brothers, when they started climbing here a lot. Bernard and John would come up and ask us about routes on Lumpy Ridge, because the only real guidebook was one from Walter Fricke. And it was it was more kind of a general description of things in the mountains. And of course he had the Diamond and other peaks along the Front Range there. It was just basically pretty general and not, so if we could do something and pass on the information, a lot of people came there just to get information basically, or would call and want to know, is there snow, is there any ice climbing? And we try to help out as best we could. So
was the general rule you had to be up and about by the time? By
9, yeah, which was pretty easy basically, but yeah, you it was a place of business, and so clean up your mess, put it away, and so basically the guides upstairs, it was pretty good. You could put your stuff in a closet, and there are all these kind of cubby holes. Everybody could have their own little cubby hole to put your pack and stuff in. But when you think about it, we really didn't have that much then also. So out in the parking lot would be everybody's old cars. Some of them would be broken down and sit there for a long time until it got hauled off or fixed. So, but it was a fun time. It really was. So
you were up here with a lot of friends from Colorado Springs. Did you find that there were like groups of people? I'd also heard there's a group of Boulder people up here too doing guiding. Did you feel like there was kind of like groups going on?
Kind of, sort of, like, there's the Boulder climbers and the Sea Springs climbers, and it always, I wouldn't say there was a rivalry there, but kind of felt it sometimes, like, oh, these guys from Sea Springs, so it was kind of funny. We all had long hair. They were always the clean-cut type, scholarly type people, which is fine. There's some really good people there. And so yeah, I would say there's probably some rivalry there, but not so bad, not unbearable where you're verbally abusing one another or anything. So,
do you think that helped the climbing push further?
Yeah, I think so. Because those people were extremely driven, right? I'm kind of a lazy person. Like, I can once I get motivated, I'm fine. I get going and I get after it. But these people are always like training and doing things, and I never really trained until. Basically, I lived with John Backer, and it helped immensely. So,
you and John Backer put up a pretty substantial route up on Twin Owls.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about what that was like?
Because I lived with John, and he was, I would say, on the cutting edge climbing. He was leagues above everybody else. He really was, and a lot of people that put him down and stuff, basically that's a jealousy thing. I can honestly believe that. Because John was extremely talented. He loved Bruce Lee, and I think, he looked at Bruce Lee as like this kind of a role model, like this guy that would train for what he loved to do. And John would train, and basically he had me out there training for a while, and it made a big difference. And so yeah, we climbed West Isle Direct, it was called, and John did it in his typical style of you hang on, you do the moves, you fiddle with the protection, you get it in. No hanging on the gear and then figuring out. He just like basically hiked up the thing. And I was able to second it with no problem at all. Just because John always had me out, okay, we're gonna do, basically 200 pull-ups tonight with weights, and it helped, it really does help to train. And so it had some wild stemming, like where you're almost in the splits and stuff. But you could rest your head against the rock and actually drop your arms down and get a good rest and then carry on. And we were both so stoked after doing that. It was a pretty big day. It was probably the hardest climb on Lumpy Ridge at the time. And it was kind of neat. He didn't fall, I didn't fall. After that, we went and did another climb that afternoon, which was a pretty hard climb also, and it felt much easier. So, and it was probably 11 B or C, that route. And so, yeah, he was a good motivator, he really was.
Do you know why it was named Silly Putty?
Because they said after he led the pitch, his arms just felt like there was nothing left, so that's why he called it Silly Putty.
So you've done a whole lot of climbing up at Lumpy.
Yes.
What would you say, what's your favorite crag up there?
I'd say kind of would be the place I go for the day. I hate to say there's one crag that I like more than another, but I love Sundance. I love going to Sundance because, one, I think it's the taller crag of it all, and I can't say there's a specific route I love on any particular rock. I like doing variations of lots of different climbs. Like on the book, I used to love doing Fat City 44 to High Plains Drifter to either Cheap Date or High Plains Drifter as a finish, and that gave you all these pretty technical pitches, but it made for a really beautiful climb. So I like I can go up and I can weave all over the place and put together things that are kind of all the better pitches of certain climbs, and that's a lot of fun to do. So,
what would you say your proudest climb is up there?
And that's a tough. I mean, of course, Silly Putty was a proud moment because nothing had ever been done that hard before on Lumpy Ridge. But a lot of that was John, right? I didn't lead the pitch, and I think really you as a climber, when you lead the pitch, that's really where the credit should go. I mean, I was able to second it, and I didn't have a hard time with it. I mean, it was hard, but it wasn't like I was shaking or anything. I always felt like I was under total control.
Okay, so let's get back to guiding. So you guided to the late 70s.
Mm-hmm.
When did you quit guiding?
Probably the earlier 80s, and I started working for Komito more full time. So I would guide for Michael, and then I started helping Steve at the shop, resoling boots and, selling footwear. At the old shop, he used to sell a lot of footwear, and that was kind of fun. People would come, and he'd have certain boots that you could only buy at Komito Boots, and that was kind of a neat thing. So then as, time progresses, then you're competing with other big outdoor retailers, and that makes life a little tough. So.
And then when did you start getting into rigging?
That was the early 90s when, I'd done a small job on Twin Owls. Here was my first real movie job, and that was through Michael Weiss. He wasn't there at the time, but he gave the job to Duncan Ferguson, and Duncan was kind of in charge. And we'd just go up and set up anchors for the cameramen. Duncan took a long fall off the top of Twin Owls and shot over West Owl Direct, or Silly Putty as it's called now. So he shot off those overhangs and probably took like a 60-foot fall. And it's kind of a motivation type film for corporate ladder type people. It's like you too can work up the ladder if you're motivated to do these. And somehow I have a copy of it. You can watch it. Sometimes it's kind of silly, really. After being in the business for a long time, I look back at my first job versus what I do now. It's like really quite different. So, but it was fun. I met some neat people, some people I'd worked for before. I did some rigging once up on El Cap, and for this guy named Roger Brown, who was a videographer, and he's just done lots of kind of mountaineering films and stuff. So.
True, you were dressed up as Tony the Tiger?
Yes, yes. I wasn't really dressed as Tony the Tiger, but you would wear orange shorts and an orange t-shirt, and that's how I got into the union, which is called SAG. And so I was basically doing a Frosted Flakes commercial, and so I was Tony the Tiger. I did some rappelling, and then that job led to other Tony the Tiger commercials. We did one on kayaking, one on biking. So it was fun. So, but that's how I did get into the union, which is called SAG, Screen Actors Guild. And so that, basically my first real film job was the one on Twin Owls, and then the next year I went and we worked on Cliffhanger in Italy. And there's a bunch of us that went there, 16 climbers, and met a lot of talented people. That's where I met Dave Schultz, Brooke Sandahl from the Northwest, and those guys are all extremely talented climbers. And Bredwell was there, and myself, Mike Weiss, of course, because he was our boss, and then Paul Sibley, a friend of Mike's from Boulder, and some other Boulder climbers were there, and Kevin Donald was there. So yeah, it was fun. It's been a great change for me. It allowed me to buy a home here in Estes Park. So either that or I'd probably still be working at Komito's and still just struggling along. So you're pretty much based out of Estes Park. Why did you choose Estes? Why do you live here? Basically, I fell in love with the climbing here. I love Lumpy Ridge, I really do. And it's kind of weird, but sometimes I go, I'm kind of tired of this place. All I have to do is go work in some awful city someplace, and I come home and I realize how fortunate I am to live in this really beautiful area. And it really is. It's, despite the tourists and all the houses and homes here, it's easy to just walk away from it all. Just go to Lumpy Ridge, you're away from it, or any place in the park, you hike a mile in someplace and there's not that many people really, even now today. So I love Estes Park, I really do. So, plus I have the friendship here that's built up over the years. That would make it extremely hard to leave here. It really would. So.
Speaking of the park, what are some of your favorite areas up in the park?
I think probably one of my favorite valleys is up by Spearhead there, Black Lake and the backside of Lungs, because you have McHenry's, Arrowhead. It's just beautiful there with the high mountain lakes. And you get up high and you look down the valley and you look out across the plains. It's really quite nice. So,
what are some of your favorite days up in the park you can remember?
I'd say probably climbing the Diamond for the first time was one of my favorites. That was a huge ordeal at the time, and when I think about it, it was kind of a big deal. I mean, that was my first climb here in the park. So, and when I think back on it, most people don't just go right up on the Diamond and start climbing it. A lot of that is I probably didn't know any better at the time also. So it made things really actually kind of very memorable. I remember I came up and I had a 55 Chevy, and I wish I had the photos of it. I don't know what happened to it, but I went out on my way to take pictures, and I have like 2. So I don't know where they are.
And then you've also done some trips to the greater ranges, right? Like to the Himalayas?
Yes, I've been to India once. I've been to Pakistan twice, and I don't think first time I went to Pakistan, I went on a film crew with, it's called WQED in National Geographic, and it was the first time the Karakoram had been shut down for like 12 or 13 years, and they just opened up the valley again for expeditions to go in. And so we were supposed to go in and make this film on how expeditions affected the villages, and then go up and film some famous climbers, climbing, and it never really evolved. It was too big of a project for the size crew they had. When I look back on it, it was like, there's myself, there's a guy named Dick DeMay that went, and we were supposed to hump all the loads and carry all this stuff up to these places, which, I didn't mind doing, but it was a lot of work. And, the camera guys couldn't really keep up with the climbers, because you have these guys that are highly skilled, and you have camera people that had never left, say, a staged type setting, say like in the room here. So for them just to go out and hike up to the Baltoro Glacier was a huge ordeal. There's a lot of inner conflict between the film people and the climbers. So even though National Geographic basically gave them a huge chunk of money to pay for their trip, it just never evolved or turned out to anything. We climbed a small peak there called Korafung and didn't really film it because it was just too much work. So I'd hiked up myself and found a way up through this pass with this guy named Charles Grossbeck, who was a videographer at the time. And then we came down and we were going to go up, and then a bunch of us climbed this small peak on the border of China and Pakistan. A lot of the reason we chose that because we could say we'd been to China because it was still closed to basically the white person. So, and it used to be a spice trade route over this pass. So we went up to this pass and then climbed a small peak that was like a little less than 20,000 feet there. So.
Now you've also done a little bit of ice climbing around here, which I was not aware of until I started researching you. I found out you did the first descent of the Squid, which according to Mountain Project is the best single pitch of ice in Colorado.
Okay.
Can you tell us about that? How did you?
I did that with Duncan Ferguson, and we had both worked together for Steve for many years. So I climbed up quite a bit with Duncan, and he was a really kind of a specialized, he was really good at anything he did. So we trained a lot. We would like traverse around Steve's shop with our ice tools and our mountain boots on the molding, right? Like here. So you'd hook your ice tools up over like the top of the sill and go around, and then you'd have to do a pull up at each door. And we'd also do it as bouldering. So we had this thing where you could start in the basement, go up to the main floor, and then end up on the 3rd floor and then traverse back down. So by the time you do all this, you've done 40 some pull-ups, and so it was quite the workout. So Duncan and I, we trained pretty hard to do this Squid, and we attempted it several different times. Once it was very thin, and he went up a ways, came down, and I went up and I got a little bit higher, and I got some pins in the rock out to the side. And we went up another day, and it was a total disaster just because the weather was so bad. And we finally ended up doing it. Duncan, because as winter went on, it got a little bit thicker and thicker. So Duncan led the first pitch, and then I led the next pitch after that. And so it was wild. It was probably cutting edge at the time, definitely.
What year was that?
Yeah, I can't remember really. Yeah, probably maybe latter 70s probably. Yeah, we did a bunch of ice climbing. We used to just kind of like drive around in the car. We'd drive down, the St. Vrain Canyon. Oh, there's a little patch of ice, and we'd run up there and we'd boulder up it. And usually one person would do it, all cave in and just fall down. And we'd drive around and find another little. But we did a lot of stuff in the park. We did Jaws Falls, did the Squid, some stuff up by Notch Top, and Loch Vell, of course, and Wild Basin, all the standard stuff. So.
Do you still ice climb?
Not really. I don't really care for it that much. I don't really care for the cold that much. And wearing glasses, was always a nightmare because you'd always fog up. I remember once guiding up at Black Lake, and I'm way up on this thing, and my client's like way down there, and I'm at the crux. And my glasses were so iced over, I couldn't even see, and I'm just like pecking away at the ice. And I'm going, I don't really like this anymore. Plus, I'm like freezing cold, and so I would go. I still have gear, but around here it's a lot of effort to get to the ice. Unlike some places like in southern Colorado, I've been ice climbing down there. You get out of the car, you go over to the ice is right there. You don't hike for 2 miles to 5 miles to do a one pitch ice climb.
So another famous picture of you is on the cover of Gillette's Guidebook. Can you tell us how that took place?
Yeah, I used to climb a lot. Bernard and I climbed a lot together, and I can say, Bernard was he is like a driven person. It's like amazing, and we used to do a lot together, and I've known him since he was a small, very small. As his parents would come out, his dad was a professor, and they'd stay at their summer home here, and all the kids would go hiking or climbing, and it was kind of a neat family thing that they did. And so I climbed a lot with Bernard and some with his brother John, and they have another brother named Robert. So that day Bernard's doing the new guidebook, so he wants to take a photo of the edge of time. And so I'm up there, and it's very cold. It's winter time, and I'm like up by the top, and he's going to hold off, and he ties me off to this tree. And then he runs backward and climbs up another tree, and he's over there in the top of this tree, and it's swaying back and forth, and he's okay, hold on, and it was pretty cold, but that's how the shot came about. And Bernard took a lot of pictures, not only with, a lot of his comrades, also the Hill brothers he climbed a lot with, and other people around town, but he climbed a lot with his brother John. They were a pretty awesome pair together, really, so.
When I looked at the guidebook, I see you and Bernard seem to have a lot of first ascents, especially down in the St. Vrain and the Big Thompson. So it seems like you guys climbed together a lot.
Yeah, we did.
Do you have some good stories from those climbs?
I always enjoyed being with Bernard. He is a very pleasant person to be around. There is never this ego problem or this competition thing like I can feel with some people. And with Bernard, it's never, ever been that way. Bernard loves climbing for the love of climbing, and kind of like myself. And so it was always fun to go with Bernard. It's still fun to get together and be with him, even though he's got a family of 5 children and stuff. He still has this driving energy. He still gets out. He does his job well, and he's actually a really wonderful person to get to go climbing with. It's always been a real pleasure to be with Bernard. So. And plus it was fun knowing his whole family. When they'd come here, they'd come up to Fantasy Ridge upstairs, and him and John would ask us questions about routes on Lumpy Ridge, and we'd tell them, and then they'd come back, oh, we did that, and they would be all like so excited about it. And it made it all worthwhile. And then later we started climbing a lot together, because he pretty much came out to go to school in Boulder, and so he had a motorcycle, and he's kind of an amazing person. He would climb all the time. He'd do his studies, and then he met Sally, and they have this wonderful family together now, and he's still highly motivated. He still climbs a lot. So.
And then one more picture I wanted to talk about was I came across this on the internet. You were on the cover of Climbing Magazine in 1974. What's the story behind that? Remember that picture?
On
You and
Candlestick
Jimmy
Tower.
Dunn.
Yeah, it was a Jimmy Dunn trip with, I think John Bird was another guy, and Larry Hamilton. And Larry Hamilton climbed around a lot around. He was from Boulder, and he climbed a lot here in the Estes Valley and up in the park. And he has some good stuff here. And so we all got together. This is a climb, or a big buttress out in the middle of Canyonlands that had never been climbed before. And so basically we drove out to Canyonlands. We spent the night on the rim. We fixed lines over the rim to rappel to get down to the ground, like probably 300 feet of fixed line. And we hiked over to Candlestick Tower there and started fixing pitches, and ended up on the top the next day. So it was basically just a big aid climb and going up a nice big round corner. But at the time it was something that hadn't been done yet. So in the desert, which was kind of a cool thing to do.
You made lots of trips to the desert, right?
Yeah.
What were some of your favorite ones?
Oh, I love doing, like Moses was a really cool spire to do. And I've actually been to the desert many times, and I've actually climbed Moses many times since then. That was with Jimmy, Stuart Green, this guy Kurt Rasmussen, and Eric Beardstadt drove us in his old van and just dropped us off down there, and kind of like, wow, we didn't really know where we were and stuff, and other than our car was parked 6 miles away up this dirt road. And so when we were done, we just kind of hiked back out, and you always hacked. Those were a lot of days where the hardware was all pitons, so you had this big rack of stuff to carry and lots of carabiners, and so lots changed, and for the better, I would say. And so yeah, Candlestick Tower was a good adventure, and I just remember it was wonderful just spending the night out under the stars in the desert, like it always is, and it just seemed so bright and beautiful and quiet. So, but yeah, Candlestick Tower was a good adventure. I haven't seen the guy Larry Bird since then. I've run into Larry quite often after that, but I'm not really sure where he is. Jimmy Dunn's in Colorado Springs, so.